Hello to everyone, once again. Now we begin with the session number 3, called The Jewish World. Our first speaker is Professor Irwin Cotler, who will speak on understanding present-day anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you. This morning I mentioned briefly, and even more briefly now, 3 historical inflection moments which we are experiencing now. They form the backdrop of my remarks. The first historical inflection moment is that which we just commemorated, and that is the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe, which I said must not mask or obscure what happened between 1940 and 1985. In a word, the Holocaust is a metaphor for radical evil, and anti-Semitism as a metaphor for radical hate, the whole finding expression in the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. The second inflection point that I mentioned is that we are experiencing at this point both a resurgent axis of authoritarianism engaging Russia, China, and Iran, working increasingly in a concerted and strategic fashion, and where Iran, which with its 7-fold threat, emerges as a threat not only to Israel but to international peace and stability. And this, along with the backsliding of democracies, increasingly the polarization within and between democracies, and I would say one of the most important inflection moments has been the election of President Trump, because where the U.S. used to be the linchpin of what we would call the transatlantic alliance or the rules-based international order, what we've found is under Trump's administration, both have been upended, and we are witnessing increasingly what has been called an age of chaos, rather than something resembling a rules-based international order and the like. All this brings me to my remarks today, which is that we are experiencing, which is sometimes going unaddressed and unacknowledged, let alone unredressed. I'm referring to the unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism. And in order to understand it, we have to realize that anti-Semitism is not only the oldest, longest, most enduring, most lethal, most toxic, and global of hatreds, one which mutates and metastasizes over time, but which is grounded, anchored in one historical, foundational, generic, international conspiratorial trope. And that is the Jews, the Jewish people, Israel as the Jew among the nations, as the enemy of all that is good, and the embodiment of all that is evil, reflecting whatever is the zeitgeist, the ethos, at any particular moment of time. So when the zeitgeist, for example, was the Christian religion, so the Jews were held to be guilty of deicide. The Jews were Christ killers. When we had in the Middle Ages, the Black Plague, the Jews were held out to be the poisoners of the wells. When you had in the 30s the notion, the zeitgeist being race, then the Jews were the Untermenschen, the Jews were the inferior people. When anti-racism became the ethos or zeitgeist, which found expression in the UN General Assembly resolution of 1975 that Zionism is racism, so the Jews and the Jewish people in Israel were held out to be increasingly the racists, with Zionism as racism. In fact, I recall then teaching law in the 70s, when I spoke then in the 70s that human rights had emerged, as I said, as the new secular religion of our time. And what was happening, personified with the UN General Assembly resolution of Zionism is racism, was that Israel was emerging as the new geopolitical antichrist of our time. But it was the year before 1975, 1974, which was the first of what I call 4 tipping points in the emergence of this unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism. The first tipping point, oft ignored if known at all, occurred in 1974. In that year, the following, and I'm summarizing it rather crudely for reasons of time, occurred. Israel was held out to be the enemy of labor. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labor Organization condemning, I can use the word alleged, but it was determined as a finding of fact and conclusion of law. Israel was repressing Palestinian trade unionism. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolution then of the World Health Organization condemning Israeli poisoning of Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank. I must say that for the last several years, Israel's been held out to be the only violator of health rights in the world. Not saying that Israel may not violate health rights, but the only violator of health rights in the world. The enemy of culture. Evidence, the resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of Palestinian historic sites in Jerusalem and the West Bank. The enemy of peace. Evidence, the resolution of the UN General Assembly condemning Israel as a non-peace-loving nation. And finally, the enemy of human rights. Evidence, the resolutions of the then UN Commission of Human Rights, followed by its new incarnation, the UN Council on Human Rights, singling out Israel for its ongoing violation of Palestinian human rights. And so it was then, in '74, that Israel held out to be the enemy of labor, health, culture, peace, human rights. Israel was the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. Which leads me now to the second tipping point that took place with this globalization of anti-Semitism. That took place in the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, where I attended as a member then, a Canadian parliamentary member of the Canadian delegation. I must say that when, as a law professor in the late 80s, it was announced that there was going to be a World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, I greeted this with not only interest, but with great anticipation. This was going to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century. Anti-racism was going to be its organizing theme. It was taking place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of apartheid. And as somebody who had been involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and I'd been arrested there in 1981, and in fact, I looked forward to being in Durban and to participating in this conference. But what happened at Durban, South Africa, to use an oft abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A conference that was to celebrate international human rights, singled out one member state of the international community, happened to be Israel, for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference that was to lead in the combating of racism, singled out one state for its racism, namely the state of Israel, and that began the launching of the apartheid movement. And I can tell you that as somebody who was there at the time, I can still see the demonstrations that were taking place regularly in Durban. I could still hear the chants. They still resonate in my memory as well as in my psyche, that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, but the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And what emerged from the World Conference Against Racism in Durban was the notion of Israel as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, settler state, child murdering, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocidal state. What you are seeing now today about Israel's genocide is the mainstreaming of what already had been a dynamic that was internalized, I said, in the aftermath of Durban. I flew back from Durban to Montreal, arrived in the morning of 9/11, to 9/11, and I recall a colleague of mine calling me from South Africa later that day, saying to me that if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, then Durban was the Mein Kampf. And we have to realize what happened immediately in the aftermath of that conference in Durban. The General Assembly condemned Israel 20 times, while condemning all states in the rest of the world only 5 times. This not only disproportionate, but selective singling out of a member state has continued as a pattern ever since. But it wasn't only that. The aftermath of Durban also saw the birthing of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement. It was founded at the University of Michigan, where, for example, a resolution calling for a 2-state solution, if in fact Israel were to become a democratic state, itself a problematic resolution, was defeated in favor of a solution calling for the dismantling of Israel as a racist apartheid state. Again, in the aftermath of Durban 2001. But perhaps the most disturbing phenomenon, which is maybe known only to international lawyers at the time, but which has resonated since, is that the trustees of the Geneva Convention, the state parties to the Geneva Convention, the embodiment of international humanitarian law, met for the first time in its history in 2001. Convention dates from 1949, to put one state in the docket of the accused. It was not Russia, not China, not Iran. The first state put in the docket of the accused in 2001 was Israel. And the state parties to the Geneva Convention have met twice since, and the only state put in the docket of the accused happened to be Israel. I'm not saying that Israel should be above the law. Israel, like any other state, has to be held accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law. The Jewish people do not deserve any special preference or privilege because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish. But the problem is not that Israel is to be held above the law, but Israel being singled out for denial of equality before the law. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must be, but they must be applied equally to everyone else. Not that Israel should not respect human rights. She must, but she must not alone be condemned for not respecting human rights, while the real violators of human rights enjoy exculpatory immunity. And this brings me to the next tipping point, one that's ignored somewhat. I'm referring to the Hamas war against Israel in May 2021, where, as you may recall, some 4,000 rockets were fired against Israel, where, as everyone in international law would have said if they were observing international law, this was a double war crime, not only the firing of rockets indiscriminately targeting a civilian population as a matter of state policy, itself being not only a war crime and crimes against humanity, but the shielding itself behind citizens for that purpose is yet another war crime, let alone the embedding of the Hamas terrorist infrastructure in hospitals, schools, homes, mosques, UNRWA camps, and the like, itself a standing violation of international law for which Israel, in its response and self-defense, gets blamed for exercising any right of self-defense against a protected facility, regardless of the fact that that protected facility is now in violation of international law, as I said, because of what Hamas does. Which leads me now to the final tipping point, and that is the final expression, and that is what we're witnessing right now as we meet, an unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism, where we are finding, for example, that the incidences of anti-Semitism, largely in the countries with the largest Jewish diasporas. This was reported just days ago, again in the report of the J7 report, let alone in our global report on anti-Semitism. We're not only witnessing the highest level of anti-Semitic incidences since audits of anti-Semitism began back in the 70s, and we're witnessing it in diasporas like the United States and Canada and Australia and Italy and Scandinavia and the like. Not only unprecedented levels of that would be bad enough. What we are witnessing are unprecedented levels of anti-Semitic hate crimes, underpinned by unprecedented levels of anti-Semitic incendiary hate. Let me give you one datum, and I don't like to use statistics because they belie the human suffering behind the statistics. But just one example, that where Canadian Jews are 1% of the population of Canada, they are astonishingly the target of over 70% of religiously motivated hate crimes. And hate crimes don't just target the individual, they basically resonate and reverberate and end up being community-based hate crimes and the like. And all this, as we know, is actually underreported. Hate crimes are underreported. And therefore the empirical data would therefore even understandably be worse. And so conclude by saying we are witnessing and experiencing another inflection point in this global explosion of anti-Semitism. But what is most disturbing about it is not only that this global explosion is ignored, but in fact is sanitized, which leads me, if I may, to the final tipping point within this global explosion, and that is the unspeakable mass atrocities of October 7th, perpetrated not only by a terrorist statelet, Hamas, but by an anti-Semitic genocidal statelet. Not because I say so, but because Hamas so affirms in its 1988 charter and since. And worse, in the aftermath of October 7th, Hamas has committed itself to once again committing October 7th, in their words, again and again and again, until Israel's annihilation, something that Hamas leaders repeated as recently as 2 weeks ago. Having said that, one would have thought that all this would have resulted in a global condemnation of anti-Semitism, and more than that, that it would have resulted in global action against anti-Semitism, which would have been warranted and necessary under international law, let alone decency, because this global explosion has been taking place amidst a culture of impunity. I say that because the mass atrocities of October 7th not only did not result in any global condemnation, let alone a global action, but it resulted even in denials that October 7th even took place, in support for the mass atrocities, in justification of them, in celebration of them, in glorification of them, in the public squares and in the campus cultures. I'm not speaking about pro-Palestinian protests. I'm speaking about pro-Hamas protests. I'm speaking about pro-Hezbollah protests taking place, for example, in Canada on a regular basis in both the campus culture and in the public squares. And again, amidst a culture of impunity. And so what is so necessary at this point is not just a government response in terms of performative tweets or virtue signaling, as I criticized my own government in Canada for, but what is necessary, and we recently had a national forum on anti-Semitism, I said what is so necessary now are actionable deliverables in definable time frames where you can measure the metrics of action and effectiveness, where we not only need a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, but we need effective implementation of that plan with measurable metrics and the like. Regrettably, we have not seen that, not in Canada, where Montreal and Toronto, I regret to say, my own city, has emerged as the North American capitals of anti-Semitism, generally speaking, amidst this unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism. And most disturbingly, as I said, amidst a culture of impunity. So we need at this point a whole of government strategy and a whole of civil society strategy, because anti-Semitism is not just threatening to Jews, but as we've learned only too tragically and too well, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so this unprecedented global explosion of anti-Semitism is toxic to democracy. It's a threat to our individual and collective national security. It's an assault on our common humanity. And so when we call upon the community of democracies to combat anti-Semitism, we are effectively calling upon them to defend our democracies, to defend the national security of the citizens of the community of democracies, to defend our common humanity. And as we say, at times such as these, qui s'excuse, s'accuse, that whoever remains indifferent indicts himself or herself. And so what we need now is a unity of the community of democracies in combating this unprecedented global anti-Semitism, in defense of the community of democracies, in protection of human rights, in the service of our common humanity, and to do so with all deliberate speed as a moral and strategic imperative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cotler. Now it's time for our next speaker, Dr. Carl Jonker, Academic Director of the Cotler Institute. His topic is the state of anti-Semitism worldwide.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Irwin, for that wonderful talk. I want to use my time today to talk about the current state of anti-Semitism in the world, focusing mostly on the last year and a half, especially the post-October 7th wave of anti-Semitic incidents that swept around the world. And I want to share basically our findings, key findings from the report that we published this year, which is available outside, and I encourage you to take a copy. And there's also copies of previous year's reports as well for you to take and to read and engage with. And I want to touch on one thing before I get started, because I'm going to talk a lot about data. I'm going to talk about numbers and incidents, and I think Irwin mentioned this in his talk, and I think it's very important to stress that behind each one of these numbers is a person whose world was affected by an incident, whether that was a violent crime, vandalism, hate speech, you name it. And not only a person, but a community. So even though I'll be talking about numbers, it's important to realize that there are people behind these, real people, real communities. And if you read this year's report, we have interviews with 5 people from around the world who have been victims of anti-Semitic incidents, whether harassment, violence, and I encourage you to read their stories and hear from them. When we talk about anti-Semitism, definitions are important. And the basic definition of anti-Semitism is that there's a certain perception of Jews, which can be expressed as hatred towards Jews, whether it's rhetorical or physical in nature, and it can be directed towards Jewish and non-Jewish individuals or their property, towards Jewish community institutions, religious facilities, you name it. Manifestations of this, which I'm sure many of you are aware of or have heard of or read about, can be including calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing and harming of Jews, making dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations against Jews, accusing Jews of being responsible for real or imagined, and that's a key thing, imagined, wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or even a group, or even acts committed by non-Jews. something that we've seen more frequently of late is accusing Jews of dual loyalty, that you're more loyal to Israel than, say, the United States or to Canada or the country that you live in. And a final one, which has become far, far more common, is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, which is something that has increased dramatically since October 7th. As was mentioned, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest conspiracy theories in history. It's a sickness that blinds those who consume it from seeing the truth of what is and from respecting humanity of others. Today, most of this is propagated on social media, whether it's on Twitter, Telegram, other social media platforms. But these falsehoods, these conspiracy theories that are spread online come into the real world. They don't stay out in the atmosphere online in the virtual world, they come into the real world. And those impact the incidents that we'll talk about here in a bit. Now, one of the biggest challenges that's presented by contemporary anti-Semitism is that it's expressed by both the right and the left, mostly on the extremes of both sides of the political spectrum. But what we've seen in recent years is a mainstreaming, and a mainstreaming that comes from both sides of the political spectrum and are encroaching on the center. Now, criticizing Israel, even in harsh terms, is not anti-Semitism. However, seeking Israel's elimination, setting it apart amongst all nations and scapegoating it is. Even arguments that Israel is a colonial enterprise are anti-Semitic. Israel is not a colonial enterprise. It's a historical falsehood. And something that Irwin mentioned that is obvious after October 7th, but also happened in May of 2021 and previously, is that you see dramatic rises in the number of anti-Semitic incidents when there is an intensification of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Not only an intensification of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you also see it when there are major world events, like COVID-19 several years ago. These are drivers where people are looking for simple explanations, for explanations of what's going wrong, and looking for scapegoats, and these lead to these intensifications. Now, following the October 7th attack by Hamas, the world has seen the worst wave of anti-Semitic incidents since the end of the Second World War. Across the world, even where the number of incidents declined in 2024, anti-Semitism remained higher than in any other previous year. Okay? We're at higher levels than ever before. But what's interesting and what we found in our report is that contrary to common perceptions, the peak of the wave in this explosion of global anti-Semitism happened immediately after the October 7th attack, not as the war progressed. There was a peak and a high mark in October, November, December of 2023, and then a decline started to happen. But these levels, again, throughout 2024 stayed higher than before. And I'll show you some graphs here in a minute to show you what I mean. What does this mean? It means that anti-Semitism raised its most violent and ugly head when Israel appeared most fragile and weak, not when Israel was not on the offensive. Not when there was a humanitarian issue in Gaza, before Israel even started bombing, before Israel had when we were in the midst of being attacked. This was when the wave started. There are examples of, Harvard University and protests right on October 7th happening on that moment, on that same day. There was a Students for Justice in Palestine reactivated their Twitter account just reportedly minutes before the attack even happened. And this suggests that there was something pre-planned, that there was something organized in this explosion. And we need to investigate this. We need to investigate why there was this tsunami, this incredible wave of anti-Semitic incidents right in the immediate aftermath, and why it took place. Why was there a coordinated effort, if there was a coordinated effort, to sow discord in societies in Western democracies and intimidate friends of Israel at a time of Israel's most need? To talk about specific countries, one of the countries that stood out this year in our report more so than others was Australia. Australia has a reputation of being a very welcoming country, a very pluralistic country. But there we saw a threefold increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2024 compared to 2022. There were over 1,700 incidents that occurred in 2024. This is also, the types of incidents were violent. There were synagogues that were burned, there were cars that were firebombed, there were physical assaults, there was lots of harassment incidents of harassment that took place. But to show the example of how this wave happened, in October of 2024, there were 827 incidents compared to 827 in October 2023 and 478 in October of 2024. So you see there is a decline, but it's still higher than ever before in Australia. Moving to the United States, we saw a more moderate increase, but an increase nonetheless. In New York City itself, police recorded 344 anti-Semitic hate crime complaints in 2024, compared to 325 in 2023 and 264 in 2022. But in October, between October and December 2024, so a 3-month period, there were only 68 incidents in 2024, compared to 159 incidents in the same period in 2023. Chicago, the home to the third largest Jewish population in the United States, recorded 79 incidents in 2024 compared to 50 in 2023. Denver recorded, my home state of Colorado, recorded a serious increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2024, 32 compared to 9 in 2023. And in other cities, we see a mix where the number of incidents decreased, but these are cities that have smaller Jewish populations, and the number of incidents there in history are quite low. Here's an example. On the left, you see New York, the incidents overall increased, but here, October to December, you see this peak in 2023, and it dips down to 2024, but it's still higher than in 2022. And in Chicago, you see a decline overall to even fewer incidents than there were in 2022 in that same 3-month period. Canada stood out also as a country that had an increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents, recording their highest number of incidents ever, over 6,200 incidents compared to over 5,700 in 2023. And you see here, compared to 2022, where there was 2,769, we see almost a doubling, more than a doubling. But also in October, the high point was 601 in October 2023, and it decreased to 427 in October 2024. There were countries that went against this trend, where the overall number of incidents decreased in total. One was France, which recorded 1,570 incidents in 2024 compared to 1,676 in 2023. But France was concerning because the number of overall physical assaults increased. So the intensity of what happened in France was more dramatic. And here's another graph showing this, showing what happened in France. The United Kingdom was also another country where this happened, where there were fewer incidents recorded overall, but where, again, we saw the number of physical assaults and vandalism were higher. One thing that this report did, and what we talk about, is the challenges of law enforcement. So we have this data, we see the incidents, but what's being done about it? And the fact is that when it comes to hate crimes, a study that was done for this report looking at law enforcement of hate crimes, against hate crimes in New York, Chicago, Toronto, and London between 2021 and 2023, found that only a negligible number, oftentimes less than 10%, of hate crimes complaints, anti-Jewish hate crimes complaints, led to arrests. Okay? So if there were 344 hate crimes complaints that someone went to the police, filed a complaint, and the police started working the case, opened a case, less than 10% of these lead to an arrest. Now, police face a lot of challenges. Law enforcement face a lot of challenges in their task. But what can the discrepancies be chalked up to? On certain levels, it could be limited to or not exclusive to a lack of forensic and other evidence, an inability to identify suspects, selective enforcement, or simply lack of priorities or resources available to actually combat hate crimes. The types of hate crime also matter. If you're talking about hate crimes involving speech, sometimes speech is harder to prove or to find a suspect and identify a suspect than a case where there's a violent offender, where there's physical evidence, where maybe there's video evidence or picture evidence or something else that can lead to an arrest or the identification of a suspect. And after arrests, if there are so few arrests, then there are even fewer prosecutions and fewer people are actually brought to justice. And so what we have called for is more intense policing, better education of police and law enforcement so that they can identify anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents, and that they can more appropriately address the issues at hand. Now today, there's a lot of narratives that have emerged after October 7th, many with long historical roots. One of the things that we see in contemporary expressions of anti-Semitism are old tropes, old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, recycled and repackaged and brought about in a new way. These expressions can be implicit or coded, so not stated outright, but far more often they're also very explicit. You have conspiracy theories, common conspiracy theories about Jewish control and influence, particularly of states, of governments, of organizations, of media, and these have all proliferated out after October 7th, oftentimes interchanging Zionist with Jew, Israel with Jew, used interchangeably, but the meaning and the aim is still the same, which is to suggest that there's some sort of nefarious Zionist plot or Jewish conspiracy that's trying to influence politicians worldwide, international organizations, etc. Now, these conspiracies can sometimes include Jews or Israelis, but they'll say that they aren't real Jews. There are fake Jews, that Israelis aren't real Jews, aren't the real descendants of Abraham or anything like that. There's a number of conspiracies like that. There's a suggestion that October 7th was not an inside job, but a plot by Zionist Israel and the Jews to foment global conflict and spark the Third World War. There's conspiracies out there that the war in Gaza is part of a greater plot by Jews to advance the Great Replacement, which, if any of you have heard of the Great Replacement theory, which is this idea that immigrants from various countries are coming into Europe and the United States to replace the white population. And the idea is, and you see this mostly in far-right message boards and elsewhere, neo-Nazis and whatnot, that the Jews are fighting in Gaza to push Palestinians and other Arabs into Europe to dilute the white majority. And why we want the Palestinians to win and defeat the Jews is so that all these people can come back. That's the nexus of their conspiracy. You also see classic anti-Semitic tropes, such as Christian and medieval-based narratives of deicide, carnality, blood libel. You hear references to Jews in Israel as the synagogue of Satan, which synagogue of Satan comes from the New Testament. There's claims or implications that the Israeli policy is influenced by the Talmud, portraying the Talmud not as a source of Jewish law, but as some evil book of magic and whatnot. You also have accusations that the Jews killed Jesus or that Jews are trying to wipe out Christians. There's popular Christian nationalists in the United States, one pastor from Florida who ran for Congress, who has a habit of referring to the IDF as the army of Satan. And Jews as the spawn of Satan. So this is common. You also have the common narratives of praising Hitler, questioning whether or not the Holocaust actually occurred, and accusing Jews of being supremacists in their culture and in their religion. What are the implications of this? At the end of the day, racism is racism is racism. There's no good racism or bad racism. Hating Jews is a form of racism, and prejudice against Jews, like other forms of racism and discrimination, undermine democratic values. And it's important, and Irwin mentioned this, and I'll stress it again, that the threat faced by Jewish communities around the world is not just a threat to Jewish communities. It's a threat to democratic societies. It's a threat to other religious minorities. It's a threat to the social fabric and the strength of society in Western democracies. It has a way of metastasizing into other forms of hate. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carl Jonker, for your presentation. Now, our final speaker in this session is Professor Dina Porat, former Chief Historian of Yad Vashem. She will speak on the following topic: how should we teach the dark pages of the past?
First of all, let me mention how proud I am, because a team in Tel Aviv University, which I headed for many years, started issuing an annual report on the situation of anti-Semitism worldwide in 1994. 1994, which means, Gewalt, 31 years. Okay, during the last years, I have handed the torch to a younger generation, and I'm very happy to see the work, the very good work going on. So, Carl, thank you very much. And Uriah, of course. Okay. Well, I wish I knew how to teach the dark pages of the past. I want to go with you to another direction and to share with you a problem, a discrepancy that I see. Okay? Because I think there is a dilemma, an inbuilt dilemma, in remembering and in teaching and researching dark pages of history. Already in the 19th century, a famous German historian, Leopold von Ranecke, said that the historian's duty is to present the past as it was, as it happened, bis war. And so it's a duty. Since then it was accepted, of course, this is the historian's duty. Then there is a religious, national, Jewish duty, zachor, remember, and it goes on, of course, in other cultures and religions. And there is a national duty to remember and to record tragedies and catastrophes as they were, in order to remember them as they were. But what I would like to ask is, isn't there a discrepancy between this duty, research-wise, national, religious, whatever, between them and the inability, the human inability to swallow what really happened, to process it, and to present it as it really was. Let me try and state my case about this built-in discrepancy and even contradiction on three levels. One is the personal one. Let's say that survivors of catastrophe and tragedies want to convey to the rest of the population, those who did not undergo it and did not experience it, they want to convey what happened to them so that it is remembered, so that they are understood, so that they are taken care of. But first of all, is this really healthy? I would suggest this word, is it really healthy that they really convey and say what happened. Because when you say and you describe, you relive it. You relive it. And what are you generally trying to do? To forget. To live on without the memories of what happened exactly. And when you try to explain it, to describe it to those who have not experienced it, then you relive it, and all the defenses that you built go down. A famous Israeli author, Appelfeld, Aaron Appelfeld, passed away not terribly long ago. He said no. Survivors, he was himself a Holocaust survivor, so survivors are not capable of really describing as it was, because this means reliving, because it many times surfaces emotions, feelings of guilt, of shame, even if they are not justified, but they are there. So when you describe all the details, re-describe all these feelings, come again. He calls the testimonies of Holocaust describers a peel, the outside of the fruit, a peel. And he says that what they are telling us is nothing but the peel. And indeed, if you read testimonies and memoirs of Holocaust survivors, and I have read many of them, I can assure you, many of those, especially who were meant, who have been written by survivors for the children and the grandchildren, do not give a full picture of horrors and of what really fully happened to the grandfather or the father who is writing. Because he doesn't want to frighten them, he doesn't want them to know what he really underwent, because sometimes he is ashamed, and again, unjustified, but so it is. If you read these books, you have right away the feeling that this is not a full picture. Testimonies as well, not only memoirs and books. Testimonies. You know that during the first decades of taking testimonies in Yad Vashem, for instance, sexual harassment or injuries were not mentioned. It was not in the culture of the 1950s and 60s to mention them at all, okay? So the picture was not full. Then later, 70s, 80s, even the same person who gave a testimony in 50s and 60s gave another one, and then he started speaking, or she, about such harassment and injuries. But the full, or close to the full, it's never full, a picture is arising only now, only in later testimonies. And I'll give you one recent, really heartbreaking example. A young man, a survivor of the Nova, you know the Nova, the nature party, most unfortunate nature party. He was hiding in a bush, afraid to move so that they see him. And among the branches and the leaves, he could see the Hamas raping a girl, at least a dozen of them, raping her until she's dead. And they went on after she was dead. And he didn't move. Because if he comes out of the bush to help her, they will kill him on the spot. So she is doomed anyhow, and he would be killed, so he stayed in the bush. And until this very day, he definitely cannot bring himself to give the real picture. He just gives a very general one, but not in detail. The second level is not a personal, it is the education, the educational one. The problem, again, of speaking to youngsters, to pupils, to high school students, university students, and telling them what really, really happened in this and that event is a problem. It's a problem. I was privileged to be invited to Rwanda on the 28th year to the massacre that the Hutu did to the Tutsi. And high school teachers came from all over the country. They heard someone is coming from Jerusalem. Jerusalem, it's like someone falling from the sky. And they came from all over the country in buses, and we had an unforgettable conversation in which they asked, I can tell you, they asked the same questions that we are asking ourselves. And they said, from which age are you allowed, or is it possible and worthy to speak to pupils and children about atrocities? No matter if you're fully, of course not fully, but in general. Is it 12? Is it 13? When? At what age? That's a question. When is someone capable of absorbing? What we are saying more or less is bar mitzvah, which means 13, but again, certainly not the full picture. And what they said, in addition, and on top of that, it said, when you are raising youngsters, the next generation, you want them to trust the surrounding, to trust the parents, to trust institutions, but to grow up a healthy person. But if you go on telling them exactly how the Hutu neighbors came with machetes and slaughters their neighbors who happen to be their fathers and mothers and grandfathers, etc., it raises terrible questions. It undermines the trust. They ask, so said the high school teachers in Rwanda, they ask us, what did our parents do? Why weren't they prepared? Why didn't they understand what is coming along on time? Did they defend themselves? These are exactly the local questions. Did they defend themselves? Where were authorities, state authorities? Where was the army? Where were international institutions? In the case of Rwanda, you know that the UN has to decide if a case is a massacre, a genocide or not. If it is, then they have to send soldiers. But first they have to decide. It took them so long to debate whether yes or not, and to decide that by the time they decided that yes, it is, close to 1 million were already gone. So if you tell them what happened, it undermines the trust in the parents, in the country's institutes, in international institutions, in God. Where was God when all this was happening? Where were the religious leaders? Some of the churches opened the doors not for refugees, but for those who killed. And so the picture is a terrible one, and it poses a question that goes on from one country to another. Do we really teach youngsters, the next generation, the real thing? In Yad Vashem, we have a plan, an educational program, not a plan, sorry, a program that goes from kindergarten to the last class of high school. And why is that? Teaching the Holocaust. Because kindergarten teachers came complaining and said, young children come home and they said, okay, we hear the siren going and we see everyone standing in reverence. Why? What happened? No, go tell them what happened. So what are we supposed to do? Ask the kindergarten teachers. And the question goes on from 1 year to the other. What do you tell? How much do you tell? How do you not undermine their faith and their trust? So a program was built that starts in kindergarten with stories, minor ones, with a happy end, with solidarity, with one child hiding another, etc., etc. And it worsens, I should say, from 1 year to the other until the end of high school. I'm not sure it solved the problem because, again, it's a very nice program. Believe me, I have read it upside down and made comments, etc., etc. It's not the full picture. It's not, and it should, I think, it shouldn't be. Okay. National-wise, on the national level, we said personal, we said education, and national. There is, again, quite a discrepancy on the national level between what happened and what is written. And if you look at history, written about certain events in which the nation, the state, failed, no matter in which country, you don't find the full failure presented in history books or in teaching programs or even in research. Because who wants a failure? Who wants to remember a failure? Nation or the public wants to remember leaders in their glory and the victories and flourishing eras, and not failures even if they happened, because then you have to face them, to ask who is responsible, etc. In this regard, the historians who are trying to write fully the failure are a pain in the neck because they go against the public wish. If you take, for instance, World War II, a lot has been written about World War II, no doubt, history books, research, testimonies, memoirs, etc., in the arts as well. If you look at what has been written, for instance, in quite a number of European countries about cooperation with the Nazi regime when it came and conquered, or when the country was its ally, or was in any kind of cooperation with, the second generation of even historians, in many cases, underrates and lowers as much as possible. Sometimes historians, I can say so, lowers the level of cooperation, the severity of cooperation, the part in which the population took in harassing or killing or looting from the Jews. Only now, third generation, younger historians are starting to write with questioning, with big question marks, and with asking the full questions. Not before. I'll give another example, not just World War II. There is a movie which I don't know how many of you have seen it, because it has been shown to diplomats in some cases. There is a movie about the 7th of October atrocities. It's a terrible one. I haven't seen it. It's a terrible one, and it has been shown not to many. It has been restricted. Why is it being restricted? It has been shown only to a few publics, such as Knesset members, the parliament members, diplomats, but it is not on a wider distribution. It's certainly not in a cinema or anything of the kind. It's not even on TV or any TV channel. Why? Because there is a human incapacity to swallow the atrocities that have really happened. Because on the one hand, this movie fulfills the commandment Zachor. It gives the real thing, as das war, as this historian said. But on the other, you will not sleep after hearing it, after looking at it. So it is not distributed, although it is a full proof for what happened. But it is not shown because people cannot swallow. Okay. Abba Kovner, a certain poet, he was a poet, a partisan during World War II, a commander of an underground of units of partisans in the forest, etc., a great intellectual. I wrote his biography. He wrote about this problem. He wrote about this problem, and he said the following: I am not interested in the past as it were. I am not interested in the past as it were. But I'm interested in the materials, in what it has, in the essence that it has, in order to build future Jewish life. This is quite a saying, because he was here one of the symbols of the Holocaust, the poet, the commander, who and ha. He was the first one to write a manifesto calling for resistance, saying that there is a plot to kill all Jews, and so all Jews should realize that, live illusions, and get up in arms. It was the beginning of Jewish resistance. And he says, I'm not interested in the past as it was. And he goes on to say, there are defense mechanisms. We defend our existence. Sorry, our heritage, our deeds, the good years of our lives, etc., etc. The mechanism represses failures. First of all, we are Jews. So we say we would better be careful not to write anything that seems like a total Jewish failure. But there were a total Jewish failure. And rightly so. We are Jews. As long as we are conscious of being Jews. As a Jew, you love your people. You can't love and be objective at the same time. And this applies to any country, to any failure. When you want to write about or teach or remember a certain national failure, how do you do that when there are really in every nation these defense mechanisms that work against showing fully what happened? And he said this with complete clarity, and who objected to present things as they were. And he went on to say the following. I'm writing that he made historians and readers face the unresolved tension, which I tried to bring to you. The unresolved tension between the duty to testify accurately, to write and remember accurately, and the goal that he set for himself to transmit the Jewish heritage, culture, and history, so the present generation, the generation living after the catastrophe, could live in peace with itself and with its memoirs, and so that the coming generation could respect and venerate their ancestors and carry their torch. In other words, he said, let's not write what really happened, because you cannot live with it, and you cannot build a future, a solid future, national one, educational one, personal one, on telling, on the ashes of tragedies and on telling the truth and the atrocities as they were. And this is a dilemma we are facing today. We have faced it before, and in many places it is that have undergone tragedies and catastrophes, it is faced as well. That's it. Thank you.